so thanks for joining us this evening, and just, I apologize. So, good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. The goal tonight is to really start those essential conversations about the developing of the budget and the complex process involved therein. Tonight, our goal is to provide the board with an overview of where we are now, and summer substance provide an overview of the rollover budget. Also, have an opportunity to talk about some of the variables and some of the constants that exist in the more traditional budgeting process, as well as those that are inherent to a year, such as this one, as well as planning for one that has some variables, some known and some unknown variables for the upcoming school year. Our true goal tonight, aside from providing the board with that overview, is to also gather some decisions and insight from the board regarding direction on a few of those items, and we'll try to go through things with the appropriate level of detail for an initial meeting. But at any point during the overview portion, ask questions as they come up, and then certainly we'll have that continued dialogue after the overview. So with that, I find it appropriate to kick things off that a lot of work has gone into getting things even where they are at this current stage, absent of that true dialed in direction from the board. And a lot of that work really comes under the purview of Mr. Lenz, our Assistant Superintendent for Business, and the outstanding work that he does, as well as the incredible team that we have on the second floor of Thompson Street. So with that, Mr. Lenz, you want to start to run through, maybe kind of walk us through what's in the folder here that was provided.
Yeah, so what you'll find in the folder on the right side is the budget as most are used to talking about, in the sense that it's the expenses, and so it goes through all of the account codes, and we'll certainly have some discussions about that. On the left-hand side, you'll find the executive aid run, as well as the tax levy limit calculation, and also the revenue that is also being budgeted for this upcoming year. So just like you see for the expense side, you'll see the similar report for the revenue. So the revenue budget, we can certainly go through, kind of page by page, and certainly answer any questions that exist. But as Mr. Rydell just indicated, it is a rollover budget, which really, what does that mean? That means that we're maintaining, what we have today with what we anticipate the cost to be in the future. Certainly, I don't have, a crystal ball, but using estimates based on the information that we currently have. The other thing that I'll just say as an overview before we go through is this upcoming year, as it stands right now, we have our 3 bargaining units, and their contracts are, 2 of them are expiring and 1 has already expired. So this budget does have estimates based on that expiration, in that, so for negotiation purposes. So so those numbers aren't set in stone because we don't have that contract in place at this stage. This is the budget that we work off of all year. On the first page, there is no significant changes in that much of it is, as you can see, zeros, and then the other slight changes that do exist are based on some assumptions around salaries, and the other assumptions mainly on this page are the BOCE's budget. So some of that I do have the exact numbers on, and some of it we're going to get final numbers actually this this week. We were in the system today, but they told us they were having some issues, so we weren't able to get everything. But
Mr. Lutz, if I could just interrupt for 1 second. So on this first page specifically, just to give everyone a point of reference, depending on your familiarity with this, really important columns include the dollar change and the percent change, which would be the center columns there. Obviously, every number is important across there, but if there's an area where, if Mr. Lenz is referring to, you'll see that there's a 5% increase. That's where he's getting that number from for the percent change. So it may be obvious to all, and I apologize if it was, but I just wanted to point that out.
So that's from last year's budget to this year's budget, that number, correct?
correct,
Okay.
that's what that represents.
All right.
And then you see on the far right is the prior year's budget, just for reference as well. And again, to that point, so the expenditures you're seeing for this year are mid-year expenditures, so they're really not critical in the decision making, because most of it, does not represent a full year by any means. So, but still, but just a piece of information.
Mr. Owens, I know we didn't get to the equipment or go through every line yet, and I know we don't usually do every single line, but how have we fared in our budget with all the stuff we've had to buy with PPE, et cetera?
We've certainly made some transfers, but honestly, as a budget overall, we're doing well, because with the support of the buildings and our staff, we haven't made some of the purchases that were planned in this upcoming budget, and that's allowed us to certainly have funds available for those purchases that we weren't necessarily planning on. So.
Okay.
So is there any questions on this first page, or any highlights anybody wants me to make? Yes.
You were speaking a few weeks ago in reference to the monies that were possibly coming down from the state. Some of those, can you just go over those figures again? Like one of them was going to be, X amount of money. One was going to be X amount of money.
Yeah. So you're certainly referring to the revenue side, and we can certainly jump to that. And the state is still, the executive aid run was dependent on the federal stimulus money. It still is, and our number for Port Jervis is $2.7 million worth of state aid hinges on the federal aid. And so this revenue budget actually is developed assuming all of that executive aid money is coming. Based on the talks that exist and based on the news reports as it stands right now, I'm anticipating that we would receive that money, but it is a $2.7 million number. So it's significant in that it changes our outlook, incredibly. Discussion looks entirely different if we don't receive that $2.7 million.
Right. But we possibly could get more than that too. Like there were talks of that as well.
Correct. So it is. It's certainly a possibility. I would say, just like any budget year, the governor puts out his budget, and then the legislature, does their talks with him, and certainly, it traditionally increases the aid that is coming to school districts. So, it still remains to be seen what is the final number. But this year, different than most, is that we have this, economic situation around COVID that exists, and we have this $2.7 million number that is now an unknown number. Like it's not traditionally how this works. The other thing, if we're talking about the revenue, is the governor again this year collapsed some of the expense-based aids into a single aid category. So traditionally there would be a BOCES aid line, there would be a transportation aid line. Those all got collapsed into a single aid category, and The real concern around that is that those are expense-driven aids, and if they're no longer gonna be expense-driven, the future kind of really is unknown. And BOCES is, a big piece of that. So we certainly make purchases through BOCES based on BOCES aid. If that is no longer going to flow aid, then some of the things that honestly I purchase through BOCES to ensure that aid's flowing. And one of the best examples is like making technology purchases. We purchase Chromebooks through BOCES, and that is to have aid flow on those items based on our aid rate. If that's not going to happen, I'm not going to make that purchase through BOCES any longer, because I can just go directly to the supplier and make those purchases on my own, and in some cases actually maybe receive a little bit better of a rate, or not have to pay a fee to BOCES to make that process, because they have to have somebody process that order and so on and so forth. So rather than pay those little bit of extra, I'm not going to do that. And so that's certainly going to impact BOCES revenue, which is going to impact some of our other costs in the long run as well. So there's a lot of things up in the air this year, and to Mike's beginning statement of it's a little different than a traditional year, and COVID certainly has complicated that, but so has some of the things that are proposed this year in particular. So I guess to get to not go through all of the details, if I just want to talk about the revenue as it stands, this revenue budget does have all the state aid that the executive budget had in it, and I did reduce our appropriated fund balance back to the prior year level, because remember last year I had increased it in anticipation of the fact that we didn't make some of our transportation expenses as well as BOCES expenses, so that was going to impact those aid lines. So there was a one-time increase that I talked about with the board. So I decreased that back to the prior year number. It's certainly something we can talk about. And all told, if you say our revenue as it stands right now is actually about just under $300,000 less than the prior year. And some of that is again attributed to state aid, because it's actually down slightly, but it's not fully down because we're getting additional building aid, and we anticipated that because of the projects that were closed out last year. But some of the downturn is related to just interest at a bank. There is practically no interest as it stands right now because again of the economy. So that's one example of
It's a lot of interest.
yeah, we were doing very well when the market was doing okay. Ms. Rudd, our treasurer, does an amazing job of transferring money around in the appropriate ways to make sure that we're getting the most money we can.
Yeah, it's real money as far as the revenue sources go. So, Mr. Lenz, while we're on that topic, every school, as they do the budget planning, they look at not just the next year, but subsequent years as well. And could you just shed some light on to Mr. Dewey's question regarding the federal stimulus monies and how that could be potentially impactful for subsequent years, and how, as a board, I think they really need to fully understand that, because that is part of the planning process.
Very good point, Mr. Rydell. As I talked about that $2.7 million that the state is, kind of filled that state aid gap, that number is going to become the number that the state then has to fill the following year in order to keep us whole. So that is a real concern, because that's a substantial aid increase in any given year, even when the economy is booming. So, if the federal government does come through and fills that gap, that's going to be the starting point for next year of what the state needs to fill in order to keep us at zero. So it's a real concern in the future. So certainly we need to keep that stuff in mind as we build this year's budget and kind of knowing what will come. And the closest thing that I compare it to is really gap elimination adjustment days, because it was really the same concept. They took away, they gave us money and then took it away. And then, each year they would say how much more money they were giving us, meanwhile, it was just filling the hole that they created because they took it away before, and it was slowly getting filled back up, so, it's kind of much of the same scenario. So, I mean, we can go through line by line, but I guess since I jumped to the chase on the revenue side, I might as well jump to the chase on the expense side, and then we can kind of go through, is that right now I anticipate next year's revenue, and that's with a 0% tax change, so there's no tax change in the revenue as it stands right now. That's always what I believe is absolutely a discussion with the board, is the 162 number. But then if you look at the bottom or the last page, page 14 of the expenses, right now with it rolling over, I anticipate that to be around 76,387,000. So really, as it stands right now, we almost have a $1.3 million gap in the revenues versus expenses. Again, that's with a 0% change on taxes at this stage, and of course we don't, no state aid with any fidelity at this stage either. But that's our starting place, and certainly, there's things to talk about because I do need to go back through and verify every single person, and then I've captured all retirements. Ms. Rutt and myself will do that, but this is an initial draft that captures most things.
Can you also tell us what's in your fund balance right now as well?
Yeah, so I'm assuming, of course, you're talking about undesignated fund balance, and that number is just under 8.4 million. In a percentage, it's 11.13%. So, and to Mrs. Lash's point with regards to expenses, this year is trending well at this point. So one of the other positives that occurred this week is that some of the money that was withheld early on in the year, the 20% deduction that was just happening on some of the aid payments, we did receive a couple of those payments this week. We are still waiting on some of it, but the fact that some of it is being replenished is a good sign. So if we are made whole this year with all aid, we actually are trending to have fund balance again this year. So this number would increase based on the current situation. And to that point, because if we were to flip to the special education line, parents and students and families are not moving like they traditionally do. So some of our expenses look a little different than they traditionally do just because of families not moving in and families not moving out. Like it just looks a little different than usual. And so I'm also trying to build a budget based on what I anticipate next year looking like, in that I'm assuming we're going to be in a normal, close to normal situation. And so it's trying to build a budget knowing that that's coming versus what this year looks like.
That's page 8 of your
And since you bring up undesignated fund balance, I will just make a point to talk about, we do, of course, have our workers' comp reserve. That has about $3 million in it, but that is for that purpose. Our tax reserve is down to $141,000, but that does cover the outstanding claims that exist at this time. And our employee benefit accrued liability, which is really retirement benefits that as a liability that exists, is just under 6.1 million. But each of those are restricted, and then don't forget we did transfer the 15 million to the capital reserve, and so the 15 million that's there will certainly allow us to do some of the initial work. One of the things that we're working on with the architects is, again, building that timeline for the capital project. And the reason why that's important to the general fund is that as we build that timeline and look at what next year is going to bring, will determine if I have to borrow next year in order to, you know, pay the contractors and so on and so forth for the work that would be happening. As it stands right now, actually, I do not have anything built into this budget because I don't believe we're going to have to borrow next year. I think it's going to be the following year that we're going to have to start borrowing in order to start paying, you know, for some of that work that's occurring.
You're gonna bond out?
Correct, so I'll do bands initially, which is short-term borrowing, and then we'll move it into a bond once the work is completed and aid will flow behind that. And so what that will do is make it so I'm making interest payments only, but I have to build in the budget for that interest payment once that's gonna happen. And so that's why I bring it up, because if it does have to happen in next school year, then I have to build in that interest payment, which won't be a lot, but it's still something to be on your radar.
So we have 15 million in capital reserve?
That's correct. Well, not in the reserve, but it's in the capital fund.
Capital fund,
And Mr. Lenz, I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions.
It's
Could
always
you
good.
also just run through, we did make some decisions over the past 2 years regarding our title grants, salaries, and really how that has an impact on the budget, particularly when you start talking about a $1.3 million gap.
Yes, so we've used many of our grants at this point for salaries, and that, to Mike's point, is for our Title I, our Title II specifically, as well as our 611 grant with special education. As I just said, the majority of it is going towards salaries, which is to the tune of about $1.4 million at this point. So if those were not being funded through those grants, they would have to be, you know, funded through the general fund. So those salaries at this time are not listed in this just general fund budget. So if they were, then we would have to obviously have that money available in this budget, which would then make it just about $2.7 million of a gap as it stands right now if we weren't using those grant funds for those salaries. So it is significant, you know, and we have done some amazing things, and the grants still are being used for some other programmatic items as well. Like I know summer school, we're discussing about bolstering that this coming year using the grants as well. So it's not just salaries.
Yeah, and we'll cover more on the programs and some of the plans for next year. You know, to continue to improve what we offer our students and provide them, you know, not to be cliche, but everything that they deserve, but also to really, you know, address some of the concerns that are inevitable following a year such as the past year, literally a calendar year at this point, right, or 12 months, and with no necessary change in sight. We need to have programs in place to support our students to really mitigate some of that. And really the vision there is we have the expanding the school day, expanding the school year concept that we've been, you know, really pushing for the past 4 years. We're going to continue to expand that this year. However, when you look at this rollover budget, you see the summer school budget from year to year is flat because it is a true rollover budget, right? It's moving from one year to the other. But we still have a pretty comprehensive plan developed at this point for what summer will look like, what the following school year will look like with after school programming, and how we're going to fund that. Some of that's going to come from this budget here, but also by fully utilizing our grant funding, inclusive of some rollover monies that we're not using this year that we're permitted to roll over into next year in our grant funds, because since we can't have our students doing some of the programs that we would have wanted them to do this year, we're going to use that to help, you know, bring our students up, you know, to where they want to be, where we want them to be next year, following some of the detriment of this type of school year.
Right, and so on page 4, for example, I'll just point out like our insurance cost, and this is for liability insurance, so building coverage, traditional, just like your home. I have an increase there of 25,000, and as you can see on there, I had budgeted actually 200 for this year, and we're paying 216 because there was an increase, and it really has to do with claims that exist for us as well as the insurance company as a whole, just different things that have been going on, weather related on the island and so on and so forth. All of that plays a part. And then the BOCES administrative costs, the 1981 codes that are near the bottom of the page, that is accurate at this point. Those are updated, and the reason for the overall increase of about 5.6%, a lot of that is actually due to retirements that BOCES is experiencing, and they have to, as required by law, BOCES has to put their retirement health insurance in their capital budget, so that's why it shows up there. So they're
This is
seeing,
our share of everybody, okay.
correct, based on our WADA, which is weighted average daily attendance with regards to students.
What is, out of curiosity, what is our?
I'd actually have to look up the number of students that we have, but our average, but it has to do with ours versus everybody else. That's part of BOCES.
Mr. Lenz, can you just, not to keep jumping around the packet, but
No,
page 11,
Yeah.
when it, specifically with the gasoline and diesel fuel, as you spend time outside this meeting, that's a number that may jump out to you. We just want to explain the rationale with that as it stands right now. Everything's subject to change, but as it stands right now.
Right, so I did bring those up a bit, both of those items, because you see what's happening at the pump right now, and I have to forecast, literally, a year plus from now, what that number is really going to look like for us. Certainly, as a school district, we benefit from, we don't have to pay the taxes, but at the same time, the price of fuel is increasing. So it's that unknown of what does the future hold? And prices are increasing pretty quickly. So if it keeps on that trend, then what's there actually might not be far off from the truth. But I agree, certainly things are subject to change as we continue to build this budget.
I think it's fairly worthy to note that in these times when everything else is going up, that the health insurance is less than 1%. That's amazing.
So actually, I'm glad you bring that up, Ms. Lash. In fact, actually, as it stands right now, the health insurance is actually a zero change. The only reason why there's 1% there is that, again, I need to fine tune with our one payroll clerk, what exactly our rates are in comparison to the employees that are taking health insurance. So there's a little bit of a buffer there right now, just to make sure we're good. But so that number actually could go down even a little bit more based on the zero change. So it's been a good year. The health insurance is definitely having a good experience this year, and they're not doing a zero with no foresight. I can speak to that. It's not like we're doing a zero and oh my gosh, the claims are going to exceed what they have.
And I think it goes without saying that it's a result of good management on the part of, the consortium, but it's also, it makes sense. And if there were an increase, then it would certainly be a large question mark, because I think we could all agree that people did not utilize medical services to the same extent last school year as they would have in a more traditional year, if you will. Elective surgeries, quote unquote elective surgeries and the like. So it does make sense that it's zero. We're just thankful that it is zero.
And actually, since we're talking about health insurance on a non-budget related item, we actually agreed on a new PBM. So a new company is actually going to be dealing with our prescriptions as a health insurance. One of the huge positives is that you no longer will, our plan participants will no longer be required to use only CVS as a provider. They'll be able to use any pharmacy. which is huge for the Port Jervis community, especially because there's no CVS that's convenient. So they'll be able to go back and using the providers that they so choose. The other positive is that the company we chose actually is guaranteeing a $3 million savings. And it really just comes down to how they're structuring plan prices and so on and so forth. But so it's significant. And that's hot off the press because that decision was made today. So. TRS rates actually can change slightly. There's a 0.25% change that could happen there in positive for us. We haven't finalized that rate, so right now it's still based on the estimate, but it's on the higher end of the estimate, so it might go down 0.25%. Every little bit helps.
I see the social work line went up quite a bit.
So that has to do with grant funds. So that's just it coming back to the general fund. As we build the grants, actually, again, that might shift.
And that actually brings up a great point, Brian. I'm glad you brought that up. So what you're seeing when you look at this is a near difference of $1 million from budget to budget with really a $1.3 million gap, right? If you follow along from that. So then really an inherent question may be, so how do we address that, right? Because that's really the work that we have to set out to do at this point. That's where the decisions come in. One of those areas to help reduce that gap and the difference between the year-to-year budget is, you know, where are funds being pulled from, for lack of a better term, to fund some of these things. And that's an example that Mr. Lentz has given, that salary, let's just say, that drove that up, that could be shifted into title grants. Everything comes at an expense, no pun intended, right? It's, you know, the dollars still add up to be the dollars, right? So that's where that comes in. So those are some of the decisions that have to be made, as well as some of the positions that, for example, retirements, right? Positions that we have received retirement notification on, which ones get filled, which ones do not, which ones that aren't necessarily through attrition or through a retirement do not get filled, because there is a gap. And then when you get to a number that's acceptable, then you say, okay, where does fund balance come in? Where does the local share, i.e. taxes, come in, right? Those are the decisions that obviously everyone around this table is an experienced board member. You're aware of that, but that's really the conversation that we're looking to start, to initiate with this overview.
And so just to give you some numbers around that tax levy limit, just so that we would have that as you think through this process. Our tax levy limit for this year is 2.34% is what it comes out to be. That's about $680,000. A 1% change on the tax levy is about $291,000. So, and certainly we can talk about anything, in between there or whatnot. But I just think that those are numbers that are important as we talk through this process.
Just to further explain that and also recognize that we may have some people viewing this workshop. The 2.34 is the calculation for our particular school district for what is often called the 2% tax cap, right? So it's based on the formula, CPI driving that, and of course Mr. Lentz can get into it further, but just from an overview, our number is 2.34. So in other words, that's the maximum that we could go out with and still have a simple majority, right? A 50% plus one. So that's not what we're proposing. That's just for perspective's sake. And again, also for perspective's sake, Mr. Lenz wanted to provide what 1% looks like, because then you could just work the math out from there, and see how does that affect the gap that we're speaking about. I don't know if that made sense or if that overcomplicated it.
So,
Right, and actually to that point, like last year, our tax levy limit was over 5%, and we went out at the 1.39. So, you know, just because that's our limit doesn't mean that's what we're doing, and that's why we look for direction.
so at this point, this rollover budget includes all those retirees, assuming a step one replacement, correct?
It absolutely does, and I just need to make sure that we've taken all the retirees out, and that's why we're gonna go line by line with every single person. That's what we do every year.
Okay.
Because certainly we could have missed somebody.
Okay.
And that's what we'll do, and then to Mr. Rydell's point, as we discuss those positions, maybe we're not replacing, you know, one of them, and that, of course, then, you know, changes that number, because then it's a savings of all of their salary versus taking into consideration the replacement.
So are there any questions as you're flipping through? I know it's 14 pages of a lot of information. As you do know, I mean, we'll continue the conversations, but you know, oftentimes it's after the fact that a question pops in. As always, I know it goes without saying to each of you, contact us with any questions. There is a reason for any increase or decrease. Obviously, those that remain flat, there may be a reason for that, such as preserving that program as a whole, despite maybe contractual increases, but knowing that we could weather that based on what the current model looks like, and also that things are subject to change and that we could decrease some of those lines, you know, in order to address needs elsewhere, in order for us to, again, close that gap, because the gap is there, and that's a real number. Some of the things that the board did put in place, all the extracurriculars over the past several years, the material supplies, that was quite a shift in philosophy with this Board of Education, particularly for our K through 6 students. That all remains intact. Items that are in here include the furniture lines that were added a few years ago. Again, I'm just giving you some of the possible scenarios of what we look to keep, but also specifically with the furniture, that could be an area where we see a reduction in order to, again, close that gap. So we need some insight from the board as to where you're collectively thinking we land as far as, and again, nothing held in stone, but allocation of fund balance as well as tax levy.
I have a question, yeah. On page 10. Page 10 is, yeah, page 10.
Page 10.
Yeah, near the bottom, there's a 46.229% increase.
What?
Oh, that was what Mr. Dewey was referring to. So that's one of the salaries that this past year was in the grant, and we could move back, but right now it's being shown in the general fund. So that
Is
was.
that because we needed extra help in that field, or what, with the children, or what?
No, it was just reassigning a social worker salary this past year to one of the title grants.
Okay,
So
where we shifted everybody around, gotcha.
Just to be clear, we have four school social workers. One of those four, their salary was put into the two of the social workers' salaries were put into our title grants out of the budget. And it was basically, we were taking away monies that were going to be spent elsewhere
Okay,
in order to assist in balancing the budget and getting where we want it to be for this current school year. In building this budget, we moved them back to where they were previously.
right,
Again, that's subject to change. That could be, we go back into our title grants, but understand that's less title grant monies for other things that you have going on.
gotcha, yeah. I didn't catch that it was that high when Brian was talking about it.
Look at the unemployment line, if you want to.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, is that reflective of we're self-insured for that, are we not, unemployment?
Yeah, so, basically whatever expenses that exist for unemployment, we're responsible for. And so this year, what's in the budget is certainly not enough. And,
It's not crazy.
but at the same time, even what's there might not be enough. It's trying to plan for the unknown and have enough around that we can make it all work at the end of the day. That's actually a great example of kind of like we're trying to build something that without really knowing.
Yeah, and you can look at the year-to-year comparison from 1920 just to what's been spent thus far this school year, and where we've landed on that.
Because some things, just to also draw, when people draw from unemployment, sometimes we're responsible for a portion of it, even as a substitute, even if this wasn't their main employment. But we were part of their employment throughout that process, so we're not paying the full bill, but we're paying a piece, so.
So we just have to stop that.
Yeah, sure.
The other piece, not to bring a negative into it, but there were also changes to unemployment protocols, which includes if someone were to resign, for example, we would be responsible potentially for their unemployment, which there was a time not too long ago that that's not the case. And that's again, not to keep using the term real money, because it's all real money, but that could be significant when you take just a few positions and factor in unemployment for that. It's thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and to that point, traditionally unemployment is 26 weeks. Right now, it's allowed to be 39. So, it's also that unknown of like, what the government decides that we have no control over. We're just responsible for the bill.
In the past, I mean, they've had 99 weeks.
Correct. And it's depending on the economic situation, I could certainly see the 39 turning into 52 easily.
Right.
So.
I think you have done a really good job considering that we do have so many unknowns. So I have to applaud you, Joe, because I know how hard it is to figure this all out, not knowing what holds our future here.
Well, and Mr. Rydell said it well. I mean, certainly, I appreciate, the kudos, but it really does, it's me and my team, so.
It's the staff, yeah, you have a great staff.
Debbie, Nancy, Karen, Jen, and everyone.
And everybody works well together, so that's a major thing, when you have people that work together, so kudos to them all.
We'll always accept a compliment, and Mr. Lenz and his team are certainly deserving of that, but this work is far from done, because what's not being shared in this packet are the different tiers and options in order for us to close that gap. Again, I have to keep going back to that, because that really is the work here, is Programmatically, what gets preserved, and obviously you all know my philosophy, it's I want everything preserved. And if that's the case, how do we get there?
Right.
And, you know, and what items are we cutting that does not have an impact on things that, you know, to the extent that we're willing to tolerate, that type of thing. So there are decisions to be made, and what you're seeing is a rollover budget. And again, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into all of this, but also being able to answer the questions that we have, which includes, you know, Mr. Pantaleone with the instructional program is a huge portion of the budget. We have a lot of if-then questions and then answers that we need. We have many of those. We need the direction as to, from the board, where do we need to land? And then we can tell you what does it take to get there. And that's certainly something we could really accentuate at next Tuesday's meeting, where we'll do a presentation, which we have, you know, 95% built at this point, but there are some slides that are questions based on what comes out of tonight's conversation, because that affects what I tell you we can do and what we can't do, and what does it look like with what we can't do. Because a great conversation would be to say that we got a $1.3 million surplus in aid, and good news,
Putting in a pool.
we are putting in, not a pool, but we are able to preserve all of our programs, and we can add the following, and this is where that lands, and is that tax levy okay with the board, right? So we're not having that conversation tonight, it's actually that conversation in reverse.
Do you have a guesstimate, or do you have to have a solid number of what our current enrollment is?
It's actually just under 2,400.
Just under 24, okay.
I believe it's 2391.
It's definitely-
Why did I know he was gonna have that answer?
It literally changes every day.
It
but I
does.
believe
So
it's
it does.
20, it's a little less than 2400 is the best answer Joe gave.
So not everybody speak at once. What's the, I mean, you know, they need some direction from us, so, you know. I've said it all the time, I want a fiscally sound budget. I want fiscally responsible and sound, but I also want our kids to get the very best they can get within our ability to pay for it.
This year's gonna be particularly tough because I will tell you, there is a large contingent of taxpayers that felt they got shortchanged this year for the taxes they paid. So there's gonna be a lot of emotional feelings out there in the public about, you know, tax increase in general.
I would say we can't go larger than what we went last year. Like, I mean, 1.39 is definitely my ceiling. I wouldn't go any higher than what we did last year.
And I think, you know, the other thing I wanna say too is that, you know, we need to come to this decision as a group, and we need to go out and support that decision once we get there. You know, so we really all need to be comfortable with that number and be able to stand behind it when we have a taxpayer, because you know how it happens. You know, you go in to get a bagel and you get bombarded, or you go to the grocery store and somebody says something, and we have to be able to justify our thought process in doing so. So, you know, I think we need to have these good, healthy conversations, and if you really feel that this isn't a good number, we need to hear that from you and why, so that we can maybe all make a good informed decision about it.
Joe, do you have a specific number on fund balance that you would recommend or feel safe with using to reduce the budget?
Well, and just before I answer that, I don't wanna lose sight of taxes, and so, to Mr. Dewey's point, you know, it's February, so we have lots of time between now and when you accept the budget in April, you know, to propose to the taxpayers, so it's, you know, things will change in the intermediary, and certainly will, you know, maybe be able to come in better. To Mr. Rydell's point, maybe, you know, the legislature, everything will be great this year, and we'll have a little different discussion once the legislature finalizes a budget on or around April 1st. But then moving on to Mr. Onifree's point, it really, from my perspective, always is, the budget is built with some ability to weather different things that occur, because families do move in and out, and with those sometimes have different needs around students, and so we have to be able to manage that, because we can't actually spend a penny more than what our budget is. So unless there's truly an emergency, that's the only exception. So with that being said, I always recommend some caution about using fund balance to pay for everyday expenses, and that the reoccurring expenses, which is why I felt comfortable doing what we did last year of almost using 1.7 million, because it was a one-time expectation around transportation aid and BOCES aid. So could we increase that number a little bit? And when I say a little bit, I would say to $1 million, maybe even 1.1 million, and not to feel too uncomfortable about it. Sure, because right now, as we started off some of the conversation, we have just under 8.4. So certainly, if we weren't able to replenish any of that, that almost buys us 8 years of being able to keep on living, and certainly make changes along the way to make it so it doesn't just run out in 8 years. The point. So it's not that we can't increase it. I just always say, let's use a little bit of caution in how much we increase that.
I understand that, but it's interesting, because all we've heard for years is the criticism about being over the 4% with the fund balance, and we're at 11%. So,
Well,
to me, if whatever we can do to help reduce the tax levy is.
you're absolutely right, but the one thing that I will say is that a year ago we were at 16%, and we
Right.
definitely made some decisions around capital projects, and it's because of that fund balance that we were able to make those decisions.
Right.
The other piece that I think, going back to the conversation of long term, we talked about 2.7 million, and I would say that this year is not going to be the hardest year potentially. It's the following year and the following year after that are probably more concerning, in a time that fund balance is probably going to be even more critical of a discussion, just because of the economics, and the federal government isn't going to keep sending stimulus money a year and 2 years from now.
Right.
It's going to look different. So that's where I say we have to be cautious, because to your point, I think it is going to be critical to the discussion.
Where school districts that have had to run their fund balance down to nil have had to lay teachers off, and some of them even closed.
Well, we had that situation years ago and ended up in the 26% tax
Correct.
increase.
Right. So
So we definitely don't want to go there.
it's always walking a line, and
Right.
and making the best decisions with the time, and just not overreacting, I guess.
So this assumes what number from fund balance, 975 you said?
902 is the current
To get
number.
us to the 1 point whatever at the bottom, based on the assumption of 2.7 million from the state. Okay.
And one of the things, to Mr. Lenz's
Alrighty.
point, but also to accentuate, it is a delicate balance when it comes to fund balance, because of it does take a long time to build up numbers, but of course it does not take long to deplete, right? Very similar to one's savings account, for example. All that being said, yes, we need to prepare for the future, as I was saying at the beginning, and Mr. Lynch just accentuated. But I also think that it is important to recognize, because you also want to be fully transparent, right? So expenses do look different. We're spending more money this year on things, first of all, things that we never would have purchased at all. And then also we're not spending money in other areas. So for example, not to get into the weeds, but the board approved our health emergency action plan that we had put together. And if you recall on that one page, it spoke about the quote unquote stockpiling that a district would have to do. One of those items was 6 months of face masks for personnel. It's an expense. We would never have 6 months worth of face masks. in storage. But now we do, that order was placed probably the day after they approved it, right, Joe?
Right away.
So,
That's why I can't find any in the store.
so, but it's literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of monies spent in certain areas and then not in the other. So where am I going with this? To bring this in, we increased the allocation of fund balance to budget, to balance last year's budget based on some variables there, right, that we needed to with the transportation aid, et cetera. Well, because of some expenses, taken away from the ones that we did have to do, we will end up favorably if things continue trending this way at the end of this school year. So as a board, I think you could feel comfortable going above that 900,000 and not feel as though you're pulling away from fund balance, right? In a real sense, you start straying too far from that number, and I think that's when you get into a more precarious situation. So I don't want to answer a question for you, but I would think that considering using some amount of fund balance beyond the 900,000 in order to bridge that gap and maintain programming is not a bad strategy and one that I would personally recommend. So with that, I'm not sure if Mr. Lenz wants to add to that or.
No,
Do you have
I would-
any idea when you're gonna know about this 2.7 million at all?
April.
April.
April, when they decide.
No, that's
April
April
1st?
April 1st.
yeah, honestly, that's my
Best
expected
case
time
scenario.
frame. Correct.
True.
April 1st would be best case scenario. I mean, I not so. That would be best case scenario that we would actually get it on the day that we're supposed to. I mean, in the past, we've actually had some years that we didn't get it until later. So I'd be dancing in the street if Albany passed it on time and sent that out to the districts.
True, and I could be just optimistic in a naive way, but I'm optimistic about that number. I'm optimistic about finding out in a timely manner, and that will end up being the number or close to it. Obviously, a few $100,000 more would be great, because that makes the conversation with fund balance and also with taxes a little bit easier. I'm hopeful that, specifically hopeful because I feel as superintendent, it's my number one responsibility, but aside from the safety of everyone, but is that we're providing a great program for everyone involved. And I'm hopeful that our taxpayers will see that when they're at the polling, have a polling opportunity to cast their ballot, that they know that we did everything we possibly could in a year when there were a lot of obstacles. So I'm hopeful that that's the case. I'm also very mindful as a taxpayer. Myself, I know what taxes, how that impacts your life and everything else. So very mindful of that, and that's where we are very structured in our tiered approach. And we just need to know from the board, an approximate area of where you want to land, and we can get there.
Mike, do we still have a lot of classes, or not a lot, but classes like in the high school, but with very, very small numbers where we can consolidate?
Yeah, that's where we have been consolidating. So for example, so the answer to your question is yes, but less. Yes, we do, but we have less of those classes.
Okay.
That was a concern. So basically, when you have that situation, particularly at the high school, you're faced with two opportunities. Do you expand opportunities, or do you cut positions, right? And not fill positions. So that's where the balance comes in. So it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, we can expand electives because we can condense sections, but if those electives are not being developed or they are not being selected by the students, then you go to Plan B. Also, Plan B comes in when you have a gap. And so an example from last year, we had a social studies teacher retire at the middle school. What we did was we did not fill that position. The middle school did need it in order to balance their sections out. And we transferred a teacher from the high school to the middle school. Full disclosure, and I don't want to talk out of turn, but that's the plan for at least one of the retirements. Same situation for this school year. So right there is one of the positions, and that would be, I would say, tier 1 or tier 0 as far as the cuts go, because I would say tier 0 is what we're going to do in order to get where we feel would be the absolute maximum of a gap that we would feel comfortable proceeding with our plans on. So those are the areas that's where we need, again, some of the insight from the board. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
You wanna go around the room and see how much fund balance everyone's willing to
I
utilize?
think we wanna hear fund balance, and I think you wanna hear that what's the maximum tax levy increase you wanna see, because the two are gonna, they're gonna have to, both of those numbers to come to something, somewhere. So Judy, what's your thought?
That's a lot to look over, and it's a lot to decide this early on. I mean, I certainly know the impact to the taxpayer, and I certainly want to keep that as little as possible.
Judy,
But I still want to be
Use your
fair.
mic, I don't think they'll be able to hear you.
I still want to be fair to the kids too. So, I think, I just find it kind of hard to put a number on that, or what is it exactly,
Well, we're looking,
I mean, you want,
well, right now, we're looking at this rollover budget equates to, let me just find my notes here.
to last
1
year,
point
right,
whatever increase, okay? That's using $902,000 of fund balance. You can lower that number by increasing your fund balance. So, I
certainly
guess
would probably feel more comfortable with that,
increasing the fund balance and lowering that number
right?
to like what number?
And then that's hard to figure out, you know?
Well, for 1% is 291,000.
Right,
So I mean, I don't think you're not looking for us to say, cut this position or cut this program,
No.
you're just looking for some kind of, and we don't have to come up with an exact number, I don't think. I think we can give them a range, like, we don't want to exceed this percentage, and I'm gonna tell you, for years, I said I want a zero budget, that's really is not realistic. Only from the perspective that one should do zero, it's always, I would love to have zero, but I don't think that's realistic.
But I don't think it hurts to do that when it's warranted.
No, right.
I mean, yes, you can't do zero every year, but let's be honest. We haven't had a zero in
A long time,
a long
ever,
time.
I don't think.
Right.
It's been very low though for a long time. It's been under 1.5.
So, yeah,
Well,
it's also important to be mindful that the largest portion of a budget is personnel, right?
Right.
And when you have contracts that have raises of 3%, right, 4% more, and your budget continues to come in
at
at
some point you have to.
0.89, last year was 1.39, at a certain point, there are some tipping points, right? What has benefited school districts in some regards in New York State, as much as it pains me to say, is declining enrollment, which has afforded opportunities to eliminate some of those personnel expenses, which helps you mitigate that gap that you're creating each year in a budget increase that doesn't match what your contractual increases are. So all that being said, I think what we need is just, if it's easier for the board, just some perspective. Again, if you keep the number, let's just say the $1.3 million number, you keep that in mind, and then you say, I feel comfortable with using, let's say, $1.2 million. I'm not trying to feed you with ideas here, I'm just trying to give an example. $1.2 million in fund balance, and I feel comfortable with a 1%, just to keep it easy again, of tax increase, then we do the math backwards from there and say, okay, we'll take that approximately $300,000, the other $300,000. Now we know what we have to look in this budget and where we have to fall in our tiers. And then we come back to the board and say, this is where we've landed, this is what that number looks like. And we can do the same with, 0.5% increments on either side, if that's where we end up. Again, just to show you. So I hope I didn't overcomplicate that part. I just wanted to give you maybe a little insight on maybe some of the feedback that would assist us in the next step, which would be presenting to you next week. What does that look like, and how do we get there?
And honestly, when they do that, we could say, wait a minute, we may not agree with the cuts they've made, and then you're gonna have another discussion. So I just think we kind of have to have some kind of direction for them to go in. They told us this is what it is if we do exactly what we've been doing.
And if I could just add on, just to keep going with my same example, is, if we leave here with a $1.2 million number with fund balance, and then we go back and we sharpen our pencils and we work that through, and we can show you, and then we say, okay, we can do this, however, in order to get to this, which is maybe slightly more favorable, it might be a 1.3 allocation, right? And are you comfortable with that? Or it would be a 1.1% tax levy increase. Again, if those are the numbers that the board ended up coming up with, that's where we also can come in and we can have that all dialed in with actual positions, programs, et cetera. Okay?
Right, which I think what important is that just because you say something this evening doesn't mean you can't change your mind. We're early on in the process, so I think that's the main point. But it's just giving us some guide so that when we come back with numbers that you're somewhat comfortable with, and again, you can shift at that time.
All right, well then I'm gonna make it easy. I'm just gonna say 1.2 and 1.2. Meaning a 1.2 of the fund balance.
And no more than 1.2 tax increase, so to say? Okay. Brian?
I would say I'd be comfortable with no more than 1.3. And I don't wanna go any higher than really, I don't wanna go any higher than 1.39, but I'd rather keep it at 1.
Keep it at 1. Hey, Billy?
I wanna use at least 1.5, and I don't wanna go more than 1%. We're talking a year too, and maybe I'm just being a little soft-hearted here, but we're talking a year where landlords have not been able to collect their monies in this town for over a year. So, I'm very conscious of that. I'm very conscious of the fact that, there's a lot of people that still are out of
No
work.
jobs, yeah.
So, to me, it's, the best we can do this year would be much appreciated.
Right?
I would like to say, those are the same figures that I was coming up with, Bill. I would like 1%, and I would like a 1.5 million from fund balance. And to echo what Bill said, you have homeowners out there, landlords who unfortunately cannot collect rent.
But they still have to pay their mortgage.
They still have to pay their mortgages, they still have to pay their,
Taxes.
what we would call their operating rate, their run rate, okay? And also, city of Fort Jervis, their numbers are still going up, and they're passing that along to their residents. So, Mike has said, everyone in this room has said it throughout the year. This whole year has been trying, it's been, unprecedented. And whatever relief we can give this community, I'm in all support of it. I realize that a zero can't be done. I would love to sit here and say yes to a zero, but I know that's not an obtainable, as long
Well, I
as
think we have the thing about the zero is the impact on next year's.
My next year,
tax.
and I keep that in mind,
That's why
yes.
I really struggle
Yes.
with that zero, because of the fact that it could negatively impact us next
Oh,
year.
absolutely. Then next year we'll be scrambling.
Yeah.
And we're trying to get through this year, and they're forecasting
worse next year.
2021, 2022, 2022,
Yeah.
2023.
Yep.
So this is why I say a 1 and a 1.5.
Okay, Linda?
Yeah, I have to agree, I wouldn't like to go any higher than 1.5 million, on the, fund balance. I'd like to keep it as close to the 1% too. Because I do know that, the next couple of years are gonna be really trying, especially if the state doesn't come up, and start shortchanging us again. We still have to pay our bills as well, so I don't want the public then with getting hit with a larger tax increase in the next couple of years. So, sharpen your pencils and do the best job you can, and, do a lot of praying.
Well, I'm gonna go along with, the majority of you, I think 1.5 million is okay. And I think 1%, we're gonna have to find a way to do it, it's just, I would love to say I'd go out there with 0, I understand, I've been educated about all that, I understand the impact of that negatively down the road. Would never wanna exceed the 1.5 million, no, because I don't know what we're gonna face next year and the year after. So, I think based on this, and then maybe something better will happen with the aid, and it'll be a different conversation at that point in time, but for now, I think I'd be comfortable with nothing more than 1% and no more than 1.5 million fund balance. Hopefully you guys will work your magic and sharpen your pencils and not go through too many pencils to impact the budget. Well, thanks everybody for your input, I think that was great.
That was actually really, really great insight. Not really surprised by any of the numbers I wrote down. But I realized that the difficult position, that is, and it's great feedback. And this just gives us exactly what we need. So thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else have any other questions or comments? I think that I need a motion to close the workshop.
No second.
Ready, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?